Welcome to WhiskyCast, cask strength conversation featuring news and interviews from the world of whiskey. I'm Mark Gillespie. This is episode number 866 for April 12th, 2021. Coming up in a few minutes.
Everybody talks about Bourbon List, and if I could say with some candor that I think that, it's become almost a pissing contest, and it never started out like that with us.
Jason Brauner of Bourbons Bistro in Louisville, Kentucky, was planning a big celebration for the restaurant's 15th anniversary. Unfortunately, that anniversary was a year ago, and we all know what got in the way of those plans. Next week, they'll be holding a 16th anniversary dinner with the folks from nearby Peerless Distilling, and like many restaurants and bars during the pandemic, the past year has been one of constant change for Jason Brauner and his team, just to keep the doors open. He'll join us later on WhiskyCast In-Depth. That's coming up along with the What I'm Tasting This Week department, the calendar of events, and on Behind the Label.
This actually feeds into a piece of work that we've been doing over the past several years, and increasingly doing so is the monitoring of the different temperatures, materials we're using for our warehousing.
The news is next on this week's WhiskyCast.
Hey whiskey fans, I'm Gabriel Cardarella, brand ambassador for the world's most awarded blended Scotch whiskey, Dewar's. You could probably guess I've got a lot of stories, but for me, the good ones have one thing in common. They're best told over a glass of whiskey. So hit pause, grab your bottle of Dewar's, and let's get back to this episode of WhiskyCast.
And now, a message from Robin Redbreast. Robin Redbreast? You may have seen me around. Face label, label face. Yeah, that's the one. I'm now contractually obligated to be their spokesbird. Yeah, my agent didn't read the small print. Proud sponsor of WhiskyCast. Redbreast. Pass it on.
Let's get started with the news. It's been about 7 months since Jeff Arnett stepped down as the 7th master distiller in Jack Daniel's history at the end of last September. He hinted at the time that he was not done with making Tennessee whiskey just yet, and has been flying under the radar throughout the winter. Now we're about to find out exactly what his plans for the future include. There's a news conference scheduled for next Tuesday in Alcoa, Tennessee, just outside of Knoxville, for what is being described as a, quote, significant development in the whiskey and spirits industry. Not to get ahead of that announcement, but the Daily Times in Blount County, Tennessee, has already gotten ahead of the story. Arnett is part of a group that's led by Clayton Homes CEO Kevin Clayton that is planning to build a distillery along the Little River in Townsend, Tennessee, with its headquarters and a main distillery to be built in Alcoa. Clayton, Arnett, and their partners appeared before the Townsend Planning Commission last month to seek site plan approval for what will be known as company distilling. The Daily Times reports commission members were not ready to sign off on the final approvals needed for the project, but that is likely to happen in the coming months as Kevin Clayton hopes to begin operations this fall. The Clayton family sold its mobile home construction business to Warren Buffett's Berkshire Hathaway back in 2003 for $1.7 billion, while Kevin Clayton stayed on to run the company for Buffett. We have a link to the Daily Times story in the show notes for this episode at whiskycast.com. Of course, Chris Fletcher replaced Jeff Arnett as master distiller at Jack Daniel's after serving for several years as Jeff's assistant. Now Chris has named his own assistant distiller, and it's a groundbreaking choice. Lexi Phillips becomes the first woman to serve as assistant distiller for Jack Daniel's. She was previously the distillery's lead operator, and her family has been working at the distillery for generations. Interestingly, this puts women into frontline roles at all three of Brown-Forman's major U.S. distilleries, with Phillips at Jack Daniel's, Jackie Zykan as master taster at Old Forester, and Elizabeth McCall as Assistant Master Distiller at Woodford Reserve. And speaking of Elizabeth McCall, she'll be leading Woodford Reserve's annual toast just before the Kentucky Derby at Churchill Downs on May 1st again this year. Woodford Reserve also kicked off its annual $1,000 Mint Julep charity campaign this past week. Each year, money raised from the sale of 11 gold-plated and 89 silver-plated mint julep cups goes to a horse racing-related charity. But as Elizabeth told us on Friday night's Happy Hour live webcast, this year's charity also highlights the contributions that black athletes made to the sport. It's the Project to Protect African American Turf History, or PATH.
So we're celebrating the black jockeys that were riding in the very first derbies in the late 1800s, early 1900s. And we're trying to they elevated the sport. We want to remember their contribution because they kickstarted everything. And, with our mint julep cups, what we're doing this year is we actually have the back inscribed. You can't really see here, but each mint julep cup, so they're beautifully etched. And this year it features the silk that black jockeys would have worn during that time period, but the back is etched with the names of those jockeys who rode in the first races. So this one has Oliver Lewis's name inscribed, and he was the jockey who won the very first Kentucky Derby in 1875.
Because of the pandemic, the cups and a kit for making this year's cherries and cream mint julep will be shipped to purchasers without the bourbon. We'll post the recipe for that historic version of the mint julep in the cocktail collection section at whiskycast.com this week. Now, it's a loose connection to be sure, but Wyoming Whiskey's label features a bucking bronco, and the National Park Foundation will benefit from 4 special bottles of bourbon that are being sold in a virtual auction later this month. The auction is part of the debut of Wyoming Whiskey's Wide Open Spaces collection. Each of the 4 unique bottles features a bespoke image, as Wyoming Whiskey co-founder David DeFazio told us on the Happy Hour live webcast.
We hired a photographer here named Tuck Fauntleroy and chartered a plane for a number of trips over Yellowstone and the Grand Teton National Park. And he took hundreds and hundreds of photos at the direction of Harrison Ford, who is involved in this project with us.
People might have heard of him, yeah.
He's an actor. If you haven't heard of him, he's also
carpenter. Done a lot of things over the years. So.
Yep, guy's got big hands. I tell you, when you shake that guy's hands, you know he's worked with wood. But anyway, he's a great guy, and as you know, he's very philanthropic when it comes to all of the conservation initiatives and overall environmental activism that he's been involved in. So when we approached him and asked him if he would be willing to be involved in this, he said yes. And so we asked him, what would you like to see on these bottles? And he said, how about some images of things that most people don't get a chance to see? Let's not do Old Faithful. Let's not do the traditional Oxbow Bend image of the Tetons. Let's look beyond the box and find some really interesting angles.
The whiskey in each of those 4 bottles was taken from 4 separate barrels that will never be used for a single-barrel bottling again. There's also a large format print of the photo used on the label as part of the auction package. For the rest of us, the limited edition Wide Open Spaces release goes on sale this week in a handful of markets, along with online sales through Flaviar. $5 from each bottle sold will go to the National Park Foundation. Work is almost complete on Diageo's restoration of Brora Distillery, with plans to reopen it next month. 3 new bottlings of original Brora single malt will be released to mark the occasion. The Brora Triptych collection includes a 38-year-old whiskey from 1982, the year before the original distillery closed, along with 43 and 48-year-old single malts. They'll be sold as a 3-bottle set for 30,000 pounds, about $41,150 each. Lafroig is releasing a variation on its flagship 10-year-old single malt, which is matured in ex-bourbon barrels. The new Lafroig 10-year-old sherry cask finish is finished for 12 to 18 months in Oloroso sherry casks and bottled at 48% ABV. It'll be available in limited amounts globally, with the U.S. version carrying a recommended retail price of $89.99 a bottle. Compass Box's Artist Blend and Glasgow Blend are not new, but they are being tweaked. Both have been sold under the Great King Street label since they were introduced, but the names are now being simplified. The whiskeys remain the same inside, and there's no change in pricing. On the business front, there's more fallout from the U.S. government's decision to relax its rules on bottle sizes for whiskeys. That one now allows the importation of European standard 700 ml bottles into the U.S. Adelphi's Ardnamurchan Distillery has signed a U.S. import deal with Impex Beverages and will start sending its single malts into the U.S. in the same 700 ml bottles it sells everywhere else. And finally, Seattle's Westland Distillery had some fun, as usual, on April Fool's Day, but for a good cause. The Inheritance auction featured 20 single bottles drawn from casks in Westland's inventory, and the auction was billed as one for those who view whiskey as an investment, with tongue firmly in cheek. The whiskeys raised $12,250 for Big Table, a charity that is helping hospitality workers in the Seattle area. You can keep up with the latest whiskey news all week long at WhiskyCast.com. This Friday night, Four Roses Master Distiller Brent Elliott will join us on the Happy Hour live webcast. We'll get started at 5 p.m. New York time on the WhiskyCast YouTube channel, along with our Facebook page, Twitter, and Twitch. Time now for the WhiskyCast calendar of events, brought to you by Catoctin Creek Distilling. First of all, we reported earlier this year on the postponement of this month's Hong Kong Whiskey Festival. It has now been rescheduled for the weekend of September 11th and 12th. The Texas Whiskey Festival is still on for this coming Saturday at Star Hill Ranch just outside of Austin. Sagamore Spirit Distillery has its 4th anniversary celebrations set for the week of April 18th through the 25th in Baltimore, Maryland. And the Nth Universal Whiskey Experience is the weekend of April 23rd and 24th. On the virtual event schedule, Teeling Whiskey Company has a virtual masterclass coming up on April 28th. The Our Whiskey Virtual Festival kicks off its series of online events on the 29th. The virtual version of the Spirit of Speyside Whiskey Festival runs from the 29th through May 2nd, and the Spirit of Toronto's Discovery series of virtual tasting events kicks off on the 30th and runs through mid-May. Remember, all in-person events are subject to change on short notice, depending on local public health restrictions. So make sure you check with event organizers before you make any travel plans. The calendar of events is brought to you by Catoctin Creek Distilling, makers of the Virginia Rye Whiskey. You'll find their Roundstone Rye at fine whiskey shops in 26 U.S. states, 3 continents, and online. Visit the Where to Buy page at CatoctinCreekDistilling.com to find a retailer near you. And please drink responsibly.
And now, a message from Robin Redbreast.
Small batch. How would you describe it? It's like an Irishman's understanding of baseball. Extremely limited.
Proud sponsor of WhiskyCast. Redbreast. Pass it on.
WhiskyCast In-Depth is brought to you by the Distiller's Edition collection. The hospitality industry has been rocked over the last year by the impact of the COVID-19 pandemic. Thousands of bars and restaurants have closed for good after public health lockdowns led to mandatory closings around the world. and countless thousands of bartenders and other workers have lost their jobs. Bourbons Bistro in Louisville, Kentucky, came close to meeting that same fate several times over the last year, after having to cancel plans for its 15th anniversary celebration last April. But one of the pioneering bourbon bars in Louisville has survived, and on April 21st, Jason Brauner and his team will host a 16th anniversary dinner with special guest Caleb Kilburn of Louisville's Peerless Distilling. Jason and I spent some time on a Zoom call this week talking about not only the past year, but the past 16 years. This time last year, I know you were planning to celebrate your 15th anniversary at Bourbons Bistro, but something happened, right?
Yeah, as we all have been sidetracked, I believe, by the pending doom of COVID.
So what happened over the last year? What's been going on with you guys? I know you've been open. I know you've been closed. I know you've had social distancing and masks and probably 1,500 other different things you've had to comply with over the years.
Right. You know, the past year has been, to give the short answer that we've had to learn how to do things a little bit differently, from our normal way. And we've just kind of, we've had to do a lot of adapting, just a lot of change in the way we do business to stay valid,
So give us some examples. What have you had to do?
Well, for our restaurant, we really aren't a to-go or curbside type restaurant. So we've had to adjust the menu to adapt to doing that. I think when you have steaks and things like that, you want to sit inside and eat, and we're just not really a to-go type place, and we've had to adapt to that, with a little bit of changing the menu up, just kind of, on the fly, changing stuff as we go and seeing what works and what doesn't.
I have to ask, was there any point in the past year where you guys almost just gave up and shut the doors?
There were several times. Really, very frustrating.
Can you tell us about them at all, or is that something you'd rather not go into?
It'd be tough.
Fair enough. I know that's always a tough decision to make, and I'm glad you were able to keep the doors open, especially since the history of Bourbons Bistro was really sort of the history of modern bourbon bars as far as Louisville and the entire country goes, right?
We hear that a lot. Doing bourbons, I don't think we ever thought of it that way, but surely I guess we're one of the first for sure. But, we just never thought of it that way. We were just doing what we enjoyed doing and really, love the whole scene around bourbon. And it's gotten better, it's gotten a lot more popular, and it's just a great scene to be in. We really enjoy what we do.
Let's talk about 2005 when you opened the doors. Give us a sense of what the Louisville bourbon scene was like back then, and what prompted you to open a bourbon bar or focusing on bourbons in the first place?
Well, I enjoyed drinking bourbon. I had some family that was in the bourbon business, and I just enjoyed it and thought it was undermarketed. And I'm a big fan of Kentucky and where I live, and really proud of it. And I thought it was just a great product. It was undermarketed for our state. And we were, in a sense, out to educate the world about bourbon. There was a few bourbon bars just in the hotels, and not really any standalone bourbon bars. And I had somewhat of a culinary background, and was really going to open a restaurant first, and then we decided to do a killer bourbon bar kind of second.
And it's the bourbon that you've become known for as well as the food now.
That's correct. Yeah, we kind of were one of the first to. There were several whiskey bars around the country, and just focusing on all types of whiskey. But I think we were probably one of the first ones that focused on just bourbon and some kind of fine dining.
And arguably one of the first in a smaller city. You could find them in New York, Chicago, San Francisco, but probably not in Louisville until you guys came along, right?
Yeah, like I said, there were a couple of the hotels, the older hotels had what they would call bourbon lists, I think, because we did a little bit of research there. But like I said, most places around the country were whiskey bars. They prided themselves on Scotch as well as Canadian and other types of whiskey. And they had bourbon, but I don't think to the extent that most places have it today.
And I think a lot of that's because there wasn't as much demand for it. How hard was it in that initial year or two to really attract locals as well as the out-of-town crowd, the conventioneers and other folks, because that was really about the time the Bourbon Trail was just getting going as well.
Right. The locals really don't really care that much about us, I would think, at least at first, because I think it was so commonplace here in Louisville that, everybody had been somewhat associated with bourbon, I guess, or, had been around it, and it was really no big deal to them. What we saw were these out-of-towners, these convention people who were really curious about bourbon. We knew when there was a convention in town because we'd just be slammed. The doors would be packed. And you'd be surprised. A lot of these people from around the country were just really curious about bourbon. And that, for a while, was our mainstay customer.
What's the craziest story that happened over the years? I know there's been some crazy ones, but what's the most unusual one to you of someone who came in just to go nuts over bourbon?
I think one of the craziest to me is people wanting to meet me that had seen me in a documentary or something. There's a guy from Germany who's got this huge whiskey bourbon collection. And I think even Brown-Forman did something with him before, but he could barely speak English and came in. He took a picture of me like on his TV. And so he brought the picture of me on TV and he said he wanted to meet me. It was just, and he was from Germany and it was the weirdest thing.
I can imagine that, having run into some of our listeners from Germany and from other countries as well. Any idea how many countries you've drawn visitors from?
I don't know. I always look at those maps and other restaurants and bars and, you have a little pin on from where they came from. But I always wanted one of those, but it's hard to say. It really is.
What was your original bourbon list like when you guys opened?
And everybody talks about bourbon list. And if I could say with some candor that I think that, it's become almost a pissing contest. And it never started out like that with us. We wanted every bourbon that was available to us because, for example, if a customer would come in and say, well, my great uncle used to work for J.W. Dant, and we didn't have Dant, and we were called Bourbons Bistro, what kind of bourbon bar am I opening if I didn't have what they wanted? And so it really wasn't about the list at first. It was just about giving people what they wanted, and making sure we had that. But our first list was, I would say, maybe 90, 100 bourbons. And at that time, I think there were 300 labels, which, were going overseas or whatever. So we always carried about 100 bourbons. And it was just for the fact that I wanted to, if somebody came in and asked for it, I wanted to have it. It wasn't like I've got the biggest list in town. You know what I mean?
Oh, I know. I'm just saying that back in 2005, there weren't that many bourbons. It's not like today where everybody and their brother has a bourbon brand.
Right. I mean, there were, that we always call it the big 8 of the big distilleries. And we had all of that, but we did have, there were roughly 100 probably labels that we could get a hold of that were, bottom shelf stuff. And I just said, if it's a bourbon, bring it. And we had some humdingers, pretty weird stuff.
And I'm betting you had some of the original Pappies at that time, too, and it wasn't the cult favorite that it is today.
Oh, that's true. I've sat with Julian and Preston, and we've had many drinks of Pappy and plenty of different whiskey as well. We did those bourbon dinners at first. I mean, we've probably done over 100 bourbon dinners. We would do a different distillery every month. And, just got to meet all the persons of interest from each distillery or distiller. It's like one big family. It was a great time. It still is a great time. Everybody's a little busier than they were back then. I could book them a lot easier back then than I can now.
I can imagine that. You were also at the beginning of the Urban Bourbon Trail in Louisville, if I remember correctly, right?
Yes. Stacy Yates, wonderful lady that works with the Convention Bureau. We sat and she chatted about a kind of a thought that she had, and we were more than welcome to join in and do what we could to get that started with her. Yes.
And I think it was originally something like 8 bars at first, and now it's up to close to 40, or at least it was before the pandemic.
I think there were seven original stops.
Okay.
And maybe, I don't even know how many of the original are still open. Maybe 2. The ones in the hotel have become something different, so they're still on there, but in a different capacity, I guess.
Let's talk about those bourbon dinners again for a second, because you sort of were on that forefront of pairing up bourbons with good food with these dinners.
Yeah, I've got somewhat of a culinary background. I started my first restaurant when I was 21 and been doing a lot of cooking over the years. And once I finally got my real passion for bourbon, I thought, what a great, there's so many flavor profiles that come out of bourbon. And we just started really tinkering around with it and found that it worked really well.
Who have you not been able to get for a bourbon dinner that you'd like to get?
I'm pretty sure we've had them all. Over the years, I mean, like I said, we've probably done 75 to 100 bourbon dinners over the years. And, I've sat down with, you name it, Bill Samuels had, Eddie Russell, Jimmy Russell. They're all, you can, I never did get to meet Booker. I guess that would be, I never did get to meet Booker. No, that would have been a good one. I was very fortunate to, not Wes, but Lincoln Henderson. I did get to meet Lincoln before he passed away, and I'm in a documentary with Elmer T. Lee, which is pretty cool. But other than that, we've tried to extend our olive branch to everybody, and they usually accept. Like I said, it's kind of like one big happy family, really.
Does that olive branch extend outside of the Commonwealth with all these other bourbons popping up from around the country?
It as far as us selling them, it does. And I would be open to, if people are traveling and coming into the state. I did meet with the Garrison brothers at one point, but we didn't do a dinner or anything. Yeah, I'm actually good friends with the people at Uncle Nearest. I would probably do that. And Uncle Nearest dinner would be cool. But yeah, it's if they want to do it, we'd love to have them.
Give me your take on this just explosion of bourbons around the country, because I think we've almost got a bourbon being made in just about every state in the U.S. now. There may be one or two that aren't, but I know they're making them in Alaska and Hawaii, so those would be the two most remote ones. But what's your take on this whole bourbon explosion?
I'm a huge fan of bourbon, and I guess maybe not, I wouldn't say snobby, but I obviously love Kentucky bourbon the best. I'm all for it, I guess. I think it can be a double-edged sword at times. Like I said, we've always set out to educate people about bourbon, and it's really taken off, and it's not because of us, but it's everybody that's interested in the industry and all of that. It can be a double-edged sword at times. I had one of the first bourbon bars, and now there's 40. So it kind of cuts into my customers or what I wanted people to come and learn from us, of course. But, I'm all for it. We're all for it. One of our first T-shirts always said, bringing bourbon back one sip at a time. So I think it's back.
No arguments there. Tell me about the barrel picking business, because you started picking barrels for Bourbons Bistro a while back and putting some of your own stuff into a bottle too, right?
Yeah, we've done probably over 100 barrel picks as well at Bourbons. Love to do it. It's just so cool to me, that's the most exclusive bourbon on the earth at that time, when I can say, I want that barrel and I want you to bottle it for me. That's a good feeling. It's just a great feeling to be able to do that. And I guess over the years, people have said I have I've got a knack for it. I'm picking kind of the best of the best. And they've always been big sellers. And, we're just real happy we can do that. We don't get to do it as much as I used to, obviously, because of the growth of the bourbon business. Like I said, it's a double-edged sword to where, I was doing all these single barrel picks, and now I get very limited picks. So
what do you look for when you're picking a single barrel?
What I always look for is I want the full, what I call a full dog and pony show, from the front to the back to the finish and the chest. There's certain bourbons out there that'll finish up front or have a real strong middle palate or even finish in the back. I'm kind of looking for that front to back wash, this viscous mouthfeel. And, it usually is going to be around 100 proof, if not a little more. But, I'm just, like I said, I'm kind of looking for the whole package. And sometimes you can't find that, Sometimes you just have to say, I'm going to have to pass on this round of barrels.
What's it like when you're trying to pick barrels with, say, a Jimmy Russell?
I mean, what a great time, A lot of these guys that you'll sit with and pick with, they don't want to say anything because I think people are easily led off of a cliff. You say, oh, well, you might say it tastes like bubble gum. And somebody say, oh yeah, I kind of see that now. But especially Jim Rutledge would always do that. He would never say a word while we did that. And he just kind of let you do it yourself, which was cool. And it was a learning experience as well.
Who was the one who would give you the hardest time about picking their barrels?
That was Jimmy Rutledge for sure. Yeah, he would say, you bourbon boys at Bourbons, y'all like that high proof stuff. I was like, come on, Jim, that's where all the flavor is, This is the pinnacle of it. This is the best of the best. And they used to do a barrel strength, and I've had some barrels out of there that were like 134, 125, 127. They're big boys. And he always kind of gave me a bunch of grief about that.
What's the biggest misconception about bourbon that most people have? I know that this whole neck pour thing has become, a bit of a red herring, I think, over the last year or so. But what's the biggest misconception that we need to correct about bourbon?
Well, the reason I started Bourbons was to educate people about bourbon. And I think that's just what we need to do. A lot of people think, we're barefoot in overalls down by the creek cooking some shine, when bourbon is this elegant drink that has, I think even Woodford Reserve says there's over 200 different flavors in there, so I think it's just not a college shooting shots type of drink. And that's what we're out to educate people about. And that's the main goal for me, is to have people look at our native spirit, Kentucky bourbon, and think, what a great, there's history in that glass, and there's a lot of work that goes into it, and there's a lot of complex flavors there, and it's just not for, shooting shots. You know what I mean?
Oh yeah, I hear that. We should talk about your anniversary dinner coming up on the 16th with Caleb Kilburn from Peerless Distilling. First of all, what's on the menu, both food-wise and whiskey-wise, and why did you pick Peerless for your 16th anniversary dinner?
Well, Peerless has been, they're good folks. We work well with them. I have yet to get a single barrel for them, but they're definitely on the list. And we've never done one with Peerless. They have an interesting story, and Caleb does a great job, and I just enjoy those guys. And it's not that we would pick them over anybody else. It's just, it was kind of their time to shine. So we decided to do it, and we haven't done dinners for a while, and they were available. So that's just how it came about.
Tell me how long it's going to take you guys to get back to normal, if we can decide what a new normal is going to be once the pandemic's over.
I think we'll probably be back to normal come this fall. I look for the holiday season to be, hopefully we're going to be back to normal.
Tourism-wise too, hopefully, right? Or that's more next year, maybe?
Definitely. If we're not back to 100% by next Derby, I don't know what we're going to do.
Tickets are still available for the Bourbons Bistro Anniversary Dinner on April 21st, along with their Kentucky Derby and Oaks Handicapping Dinner on the 27th. There's a link for more details in our show notes for this episode at whiskycast.com. That's WhiskyCast In-Depth, brought to you by the Distiller's Edition collection lineup of single malts from Diageo's Classic Malts. Look for the new editions of Oban, Talisker, Lagavulin, Cragganmore, Dalwhinnie, and Glenkinchie at a whiskey shop near you. Get all the details at malts.com. The What I'm Tasting This Week department is brought to you by Sagamore Spirit. I mentioned the Compass Box Artist Blend and Glasgow Blend during the news, but let's start off now with the latest Compass Box release. Menagerie is a blended malt that features whiskies from Mortlock and Deanston, along with a hint of Lafroig in the background. It's bottled at 46% ABV. The nose has notes of grilled meats and pineapple, along with a kiss of smoke and touches of toffee, wet leather, and dried leaves. The taste has nice touches of tropical fruits at first, followed by a nice combination of grilled meat, peat smoke, and campfire wood, along with a subtle earthiness in the background. The finish is long and savory, with a gentle smokiness. I'm scoring the new Compass Box Menagerie a 94. Bell Blair's 15-year-old single malt is bottled at 46% ABV. The nose is full of toffee and dates, along with subtle spices and a hint of berry cobbler. The taste has notes of toffee, honey, dates, caramel candy. The taste has notes of toffee, honey, dates, caramel candy, and just a touch of allspice. The finish has that lingering touch of allspice, balanced nicely by honey and toffee. There's a good complexity to this one. I'm scoring the Bell Blair 15-year-old a 92. I'll have more tasting notes in just a minute, but first, this week's tasting notes are brought to you by Sagamore Spirit Rye Whiskey. Want to find out how Sagamore Spirit is reviving and evolving the tradition of Maryland-style rye whiskey, including its new tequila cask-finished rye? In-person tastings are available once again at the distillery in Baltimore. You'll also find a variety of virtual tours, tastings, and other experiences at the Sagamore Spirit website. They're offering WhiskyCast listeners a free virtual guided tasting. Purchase bottles from your local retailer, and a Sagamore Spirit teammate will guide you through each one. Visit SagamoreSpirit.com and use the code WhiskyCast, all one word, to access. Please drink responsibly. Turning now to Dram Moore's Tomintoul 15-year-old single malt. It's matured in a refill Oloroso sherry cask and finished in a Sauterne wine cask, and it's bottled at 56.1% ABV. The nose has a touch of white pepper, along with lemon zest, dried apple chips, a hint of dried flowers, vanilla, and milk chocolate. The dark chocolate comes alive on the palate, along with a spicy hint of cayenne pepper and touches of apples, lemon zest, and vanilla, leading into a long and well-balanced finish. I'm scoring the Dram Moore Tomintoul 15-year-old a 92. Finally, let's look at one of the latest J.J. Corey releases from Ireland's Chapel Gate Whiskey Company. The Story was bottled in collaboration with Barry Chandler's Stories and Sips. It's bottled at 46% ABV. The nose has notes of straw, butterscotch, brown sugar, and caramel candy. The taste is well-rounded, with a nice touch of baking spices, along with butterscotch, caramel, honey, and a hint of coconut. The finish has lingering spices, along with dried fruits, caramel, and butterscotch. There's an excellent balance to this one. I'm scoring the J.J. Corey The Story a 93. The What I'm Tasting This Week department is brought to you by Sagamore Spirit. I'll be adding these whiskeys to our searchable list of nearly 3,100 different whiskeys from all over the world. Check it out this week at whiskycast.com.
Hey, what's up, everybody? It's Gabriel Cardarella again, the Doers Guy. I've seen a lot in my years as a brand ambassador for the world's most awarded blended scotch. Like the time I got to host a Doers tasting for some members of a major European royal family. Now, I'm not going to say which one, but they did invite me to come stay at their castle. Pretty cool, right? Well, here's another story for you. In 2019, our master blender, Stephanie Mcleod, became the first woman to be awarded Master Blender of the Year by the International Whiskey Competition. And a year after that, she won it again. Stephanie's first creation for Dewar's 15 year, is another piece of history. Sweet, floral, with notes of honey and toffee, a perfectly balanced addition to the Dewar's lineup. It's a great introduction to scotch for beginners, and it's more than complex enough to satisfy whiskey aficionados. So grab some Dewar's 15, call some friends, and make a few stories of your own. That's what a good bottle of whiskey is all about.
Let's open up the inbox now for your voice. I have a sad story to share from Eamon Haggerty in Northern Ireland. He posted a photo Saturday night on Twitter during the hashtag Saturday Night Sip virtual get-together of a healthy dram of Red Spot in what he described as his prized WhiskyCast Glencairn glass. Now, that's not the sad part, but you might be able to guess what's coming. The second tweet later on, what was left of his empty and broken WhiskyCast glass with this comment. The one Glencairn glass I done my utmost to protect and never normally use is the one gets knocked by a sleepy toddler. Now, I obviously recognized that glass, but there's more to it. You see, it was one of our original Glencairn glasses that had a much larger logo than the ones we send out to Whiskey Club of the Month winners these days. And that means Eamon has been listening for many, many years. So I checked with the boss. Turns out we have a sleepy toddler damage policy I didn't know about, so we're going to send Eamon a new glass to replace it. Barbara Townsend is at B. Townsend Writer on Twitter. She and her husband Bob owned the old Miner's Delight Inn in Atlantic City, Wyoming for a few years, and she sent this the other day. Dear Father Confessor WhiskyCast, while watching an episode of Midsummer Murders, a man was crushed to death when his liquor cabinet toppled over on him. I rewound the video to check out his doomed single malt scotch collection. Hang's Head. How many slanches for absolution? Well, no absolution needed there, Barbara. Of course, thoughts and prayers for the lost whiskeys are always appropriate. Last week we had Glenn Grant's Dennis Malcolm on the Happy Hour live webcast on the eve of his 60th anniversary in the Scotch whiskey business, and there were a lot of comments congratulating him on that anniversary. Then there was this one from Glenda Coe. I think his daughter worked harder in her 30 years. Of course, Glenda is Dennis's daughter and spent 30 years in the Scottish police force before retiring. Nothing quite like family members to keep you honest, or for that matter, Sam Heughan fans to keep you honest. You see, in addition to the Sassenach Scotch whiskey brand, the Outlander Star has a new series on Stars in the U.S. and pay networks elsewhere. Men in Kilts has Sam and his Outlander co-star Graham McTavish traveling around Scotland in a camper van to explore the country. Watched the first episode this week, focusing on Scotland's food and drink. And no, there is not a single deep-fried Mars bar or a glass of Buckfast in the whole thing. There was a lot of good food, though, with chefs Tom Kitchen and Tony Singh. And, of course, the guys made it to Islay for some whiskey and a visit with our old friend John Campbell at Lafroig. However, there was one thing that caught my inner editor's attention. While they were showing how whiskey is made, the copy referred to fermentation in large vats, while the video showed a still at Ardbeg. As we all know, there's a big difference between a fermenter and a still. And I really should have known better than to have a little fun with this on Twitter and question whether Sam Heughan is really Scottish if he can't tell the difference between the two. Of course, I was kidding, but let's put it this way. His vast following of Outlander fans didn't quite get the joke. Not going to do that ever again. If there's anything you'd like to share with whiskey lovers around the world, you can always get in touch with us on Twitter, Facebook, or Instagram at WhiskyCast. The email address, comments@whiskycast.com. Let's close out the show now with Behind the Label, our look at the history, science, and other things that all make whiskey unique. It's brought to you by Writer's Tears. When you think of maturation warehouses, there are usually two types that come to mind. The big, tall rickhouses commonplace in Kentucky, and the low dunnage-style warehouses in Scotland, where stone walls keep the temperatures consistent, and barrels are stacked on top of each other, 3 or 4 high, on top of dirt floors. That's the way they've done things at distilleries in Scotland for a couple of 100 years or so, so you would think that distillers and blenders would have figured out all of the secrets by now. Of course, we all know that's really not the case. For instance, the 14 warehouses at White & Mackay's Fettercairn Distillery are used largely for experimental projects. That led to the launch last month of the Warehouse Collection of Whiskies, created by Greg Glass of White & Mackay. He explained the story behind that work on a Zoom call with reporters this week.
Really, this is born out of the uniqueness of these individual warehouses that we have at the distillery itself, and taking inspiration and selecting stocks from these individual warehouses that we have here. Warehouse 2, which is one of the ones that's closest to the distillery itself, is really unique. There's a lot of the actual warehouse itself gets opened up quite regularly. There's a bit more airflow that goes on there. And this actually feeds into a piece of work that we've been doing over the past several years, and increasingly doing so, is the monitoring of the different temperatures, materials we're using for our warehousing, and locations and aspects. So we're actually looking at the analytical elements of each of the warehouses and how those are different for the individual whiskies that come, individual casks that come from those individual warehouses too.
The Warehouse 2, batch number 1, is available in the UK and Europe for £55 a bottle, with the second release in the collection coming later this year. If you have something you'd like us to look at on an upcoming episode, just use the contact form at whiskycast.com to get in touch with us. Behind the Label is brought to you by Writer's Tears.
Writer's Tears Copperpot. The tears of Ireland's great writers, bursting with flavour, humour and angst. Bottled for you to taste. No writers were harmed in the making of this premium Irish whiskey. Writer's Tears Copperpot.
That's all for this edition of WhiskyCast. You'll find links for the stories in this episode in our show notes at whiskycast.com. That's also where you'll find the latest whiskey news, my tasting notes, the calendar of events, the whiskey photo of the week, and, of course, a complete archive of all of our past episodes going all the way back to 2005. We'd love to hear from you. Get in touch with us on Twitter, Instagram, and Facebook at WhiskyCast. The email address is comments@whiskycast.com.
And now, a message from Robin Redbreast. Ever wondered where Redbreast got its name? Well, let's go back to 1912 and be glad our bird-watching founder didn't spot the bar-tailed godwit that day. proud sponsor of WhiskyCast. Redbreast. Pass it on.
At Dewar's, we love a good story, and that's why we're always writing new chapters. Like our Caribbean Smooth whiskey finished in rum casks, or Ilegal Smooth finished in mezcal casks. As a 174-year-old brand, we could rest on our laurels. Instead, we'd much rather continue writing, because when you keep telling the same old story, that's when people stop listening.
WhiskyCast is a production of Cask Strength Media, copyright 2021, and comes to you from the charming, yet regrettably dry town of Haddonfield, New Jersey. I'm Mark Gillespie, reminding you that when you drink, please drink responsibly. Thanks for listening, and please stay safe.